For 30 days, he turned his curiosity inward. He began to understand that the brain is not a record of the past, but a map for the future. Each morning, he sat in silence, not as a doctor, not as a man of logic, but as a being learning to observe his own thoughts. He watched the same worries rise like waves: the fear of losing control, the pressure of perfection, the addiction to certainty. He learned that those thoughts were just chemical memories firing in his brain. As he practiced awareness, the old pathways began to weaken and new neural patterns started to form. He wasn't trying to escape his life. He was learning to reprogram it from within. There was one morning, around the 12th day, when something profound happened. As he sat in meditation, focusing on his breath and the space around him, the noise of his mind softened. The world outside disappeared, and he felt suspended in infinite silence. For the first time in decades, he wasn't a surgeon, a thinker, or even a man. He was consciousness itself. That stillness wasn't empty, it was alive. It was as if he touched the blueprint of creation. And in that moment, he knew healing doesn't come from the scalpel, but from alignment with the energy that animates life itself. He opened his eyes and whispered, "I've been looking in the wrong direction all along." Every habit has an emotional signature. The neurosurgeon began to see how much of his life was built on survival emotions: stress, competition, control, and fear. Those emotions kept him alert in surgery but enslaved in life. He understood that if he wanted to change his destiny, he had to break the emotional addiction to the past. Each time he caught himself reacting out of old patterns, he paused, took a breath, and reminded himself, this feeling is not who I am, it's who I was. Day by day, the emotional charge of his old identity weakened, and a new one, calm, creative, inspired, began to take its place. By the third week, he began to experience reality differently. He realized that his outer world was simply a mirror of his inner state. When he felt gratitude, synchronicities appeared, the right people, the right moments, the right signs. When he fell into doubt, chaos returned. He learned to stay conscious of where his energy was flowing. He stopped identifying with thoughts and began observing them instead. This simple shift from being the thinker to being the observer gave him a new kind of freedom. For the first time, he wasn't being run by his past conditioning. He was consciously creating his life moment by moment. By day 28, he could no longer fit into the version of himself who once chased approval and numbers. The $500K job that once defined him now felt like a cage. He realized he wasn't quitting his career, he was releasing an identity that no longer matched his energy. The neurosurgeon didn't walk away from medicine, he walked toward consciousness. When he resigned, there was no fear, only peace. Because when you align with your highest self, what you lose in status, you gain in truth. He had finally remembered who he was before the world told him who to be. The neurosurgeon's story isn't about abandoning success, it's about redefining it. True wealth isn't found in salaries or titles, it's in your ability to generate joy, love, and purpose from within. He learned that creation begins in the invisible in thought, emotion, and energy long before it becomes matter. He now lives as the creator of his reality, guided by inner coherence instead of external noise. And that is the lesson. When you master your mind, you master your destiny. The neurosurgeon didn't quit his job because he lost something. He quit because he found himself. There comes a point in every person's life when the walls of external success begin to close in, and the noise of achievement becomes louder than the whisper of purpose. For years, the neurosurgeon had been the embodiment of success, a man with a $500,000 salary, respected by his peers, trusted by his patients, and admired by society. Every morning, he would wear the same white coat, step into the same sterile room, and perform surgeries that changed lives. Yet, beneath the confidence and composure, there was an inner hollowness that kept echoing louder each day. He had built a life of perfection, but somewhere along the way, he had forgotten to live He was healing others, but silently decaying from within, trapped in a cycle of doing more, earning more, and feeling less. There was a particular morning when he stood in front of the mirror before leaving for work. The reflection staring back at him looked successful, yes, but also tired, uninspired, and detached. The lines around his eyes weren't from age, they were from carrying the weight of an identity that no longer felt like his own. He realized he had been living as a performer in a well-rehearsed play, repeating scenes of validation and accomplishment, yet never touching the script of his soul. His heart, once fueled by passion for medicine, now beat to the rhythm of routine. The hospital corridors that once represented purpose had become corridors of repetition. He had spent decades understanding the anatomy of the human brain, yet he had never explored the landscape of his own mind. His world revolved around cause and effect symptoms, diagnoses, and treatments, yet when it came to his own unhappiness, there was no logical explanation. That contradiction began to eat at him. He wondered why, despite all the external success, he felt a deep sense of incompleteness. The people around him thought he had everything: financial stability, social status, professional mastery, but none of that could silence the question that haunted him at night. Is this all there is? For years, he dismissed that voice as exhaustion, burnout, or midlife crisis. But there was something different about this time. It wasn't restlessness born from boredom. It was awakening born from awareness. He began to sense that perhaps the fulfillment he was searching for couldn't be found in the operating room, in the applause, or in the next professional milestone. Perhaps what he was missing wasn't something outside of him, but something he had forgotten within himself. The idea felt absurd to his logical mind. He was a man of science, facts, and evidence. But deep inside, he couldn't deny that there was a truth stirring, one that no medical textbook could explain. One evening, while scrolling through a lecture online, he came across a statement that stopped him cold. Your thoughts create your reality. He frowned at first. It sounded mystical, almost naive. But something inside him refused to dismiss it. It was as if a seed had been planted in the soil of his doubt. What if reality wasn't just happening to him, but through to him? What if he had been living as the effect of his environment instead of the cause of his experience? That thought electrified him. For the first time, he felt curiosity instead of cynicism. He decided, with quiet conviction, to test the idea not as a scientist proving a theory, but as a man searching for truth. The next morning, instead of rushing to his phone or preparing his schedule, he sat in stillness. It felt unnatural, almost uncomfortable. His mind raced with lists, deadlines, and responsibilities. But as he breathed deeper, something shifted. He noticed how fast his thoughts moved, how loud his mind had become. He realized that for years, he had been operating from a constant state of reaction, always responding to external demands, never creating from internal intention. That morning was different. He wasn't trying to fix anything or analyze it, he was simply observing. And in that quiet observation, he sensed something he hadn't felt in years: space between who he was and who he was becoming. In that space, he began to see the truth. His success had been built on fear: the fear of failing, the fear of not being enough, the fear of losing respect. Every achievement had been a layer of armor to protect him from the emptiness he didn't want to face. But now, as he sat there, breathing in silence, he realized that no amount of external success could heal an internal void. The breaking point of success wasn't failure, it was awakening. It was the moment he understood that his life had been driven by doing instead of being, by intellect instead of awareness, by logic instead of presence. And for the first time, he wasn't looking for an answer, he was beginning to feel one unfold from within. The following weeks became a laboratory of consciousness for the neurosurgeon, not one filled with scalpels, machines, and charts, but with awareness, breath, and intention. For the first time, he turned his expertise inward. He began to study his own mind as though it were a patient on the operating table. Each morning, he would wake before sunrise, sit in the stillness of his living room, close his eyes, and dive into the vast network of thoughts that had been running him for decades. What he discovered was unsettling yet liberating. His mind was not a reflection of his intelligence, it was a system of repetition. The same thoughts fired at the same times each day, triggering the same emotional reactions, which produced the same outcomes. It was a closed loop of predictability disguised as personality. He began to recognize that his brain was a record of his past, wired by every experience, every emotion, every belief he had accepted as truth. The long nights of study, the stress of surgeries, the pressure to perform, the constant need to be perfect, all of it had carved neural pathways in his brain that dictated who he believed himself to be. He had memorized stress as his default state. His body was living, proof of it. Even when he wasn't in the operating room, his shoulders were tense, his breath shallow, his mind alert, always scanning for the next challenge. The body, he realized, had become the mind. It was addicted to familiar emotions of urgency and control, and those emotions were shaping his life more than his conscious decisions ever did. This realization was both humbling and thrilling. He saw clearly that change could never come from intellect alone. He had to feel his way into a new way of being. So he began the process of inner rewiring, teaching his brain and body to trust, calmness over control, gratitude over anxiety, and stillness over striving. At first, the resistance was powerful. The moment he sat down to meditate, his mind rebelled. It reminded him of his to-do list, his responsibilities, and the importance of his position. But he persisted. He knew that discomfort was a sign of old neural connections trying to survive. Each time he returned to his breath, each time he brought his attention back to the present, he was breaking the chemical bond between his old self and his future self. He started to visualize his brain as a living landscape. Every thought of stress or worry was like walking a well-worn path through a forest, familiar, automatic, and easy to follow. But every time he chose a new thought, like peace, gratitude, or compassion, he was carving a new trail through untouched ground. The first few steps were difficult, but with each repetition, the new path became clearer, and the old one began to fade. He understood that this was neuroplasticity in motion, the brain's ability to rewire itself based on repeated experience. The same principle he had studied in medical journals was now unfolding within him, not as theory, but as transformation. He noticed subtle changes in his body. The tightness in his chest began to ease. The constant tension in his jaw softened. His sleep deepened. His breathing slowed. And his thoughts became lighter. It was as if his nervous system was unlearning the language of survival and learning the language of creation. He had always believed healing required external intervention. But now he saw that the body had its own intelligence. It just needed permission to return to balance. And that permission came through the mind's focus and the heart's coherence. Every time he practiced gratitude, even without a reason, he could feel his heart expand. That single act sent new signals to his brain, creating harmony between thought and emotion. The neurosurgeon began to understand that the heart wasn't just a pump, it was a source of electromagnetic communication, a generator of emotion that could influence the brain's chemistry. When he aligned his thoughts with elevated emotions like love, joy, or appreciation, he felt a surge of energy moving through him. His mind and body were no longer separate, they were dancing to the same rhythm. Each day became an experiment in self-mastery. He stopped waiting for outer changes to feel inner peace and began creating peace to change his outer world. He watched as the people around him responded differently, as opportunities unfolded effortlessly, as synchronicities began to appear in ways his logical mind couldn't explain. The scientist in him wanted to measure it, to categorize it, but the human in him knew this was something beyond data. He was no longer analyzing his transformation, he was living it. His brain wasn't just thinking differently, it was becoming different. The old circuits of stress, fear, and pressure were fading, replaced by networks of calm, clarity, and connection. He was, quite literally, being rewired for a new life. It happened one morning unlike any other. The neurosurgeon woke before dawn, as usual, but that day, something inside him felt different. There was no rush to check the time, no pressure to start the day, no anxious thoughts about patients, procedures, or responsibilities. The air felt dense with silence, almost sacred. He sat down on the floor, legs crossed, hands resting on his knees, and closed his eyes. The familiar chatter of his mind greeted him immediately, the noise of thoughts reminding him of his tasks, his identity, his endless lists. But instead of resisting, he simply observed. He became the witness rather than the participant. For the first time, he didn't try to control his thoughts. He allowed them to rise and dissolve on their own. As the minutes passed, his awareness began to shift. The boundaries between his body and the space around him started to blur. The steady rhythm of his breath became the only sound he could hear, and slowly, even that began to fade. It was as though his entire being had melted into the stillness that surrounded him. He was no longer sitting in a room, he was the room. The silence wasn't empty, it was alive, pulsing with invisible energy. He felt suspended in a vast, luminous field where time didn't exist. His body felt weightless, his thoughts distant, and his sense of self dissolved into something infinite. In that silence, he experienced what he had always tried to understand through science, but never truly felt consciousness in its purest form. It wasn't a theory, nor a belief. It was direct experience. It was as if he had stepped beyond the walls of matter and entered the blueprint of creation itself. There was no title, no label, no identity, only awareness observing itself. In that dimension, he understood something profound. All the complexity of life, all the struggle and striving, all the chasing of outcomes were illusions born from the mind's obsession with control. Here, in stillness, there was no control, only flow. And yet, paradoxically, everything made perfect sense. His medical training had taught him that the brain was the control center of consciousness, but in that timeless moment, he saw that consciousness existed before the brain. It was the force that animated it. He felt as though he was floating in the ocean of pure potential, a space where every possibility already existed, waiting to be observed and chosen. And as this realization deepened, tears began to roll down his cheeks. They weren't tears of sadness, but of recognition. He wasn't discovering something new. He was remembering something ancient, something his soul had always known. The silence was speaking to him, not in words, but in energy, a deep knowing that whispered, "You are not your thoughts, you are the awareness behind them." As he sat there, he noticed how the energy in his body had changed. His heart was beating in rhythm with something larger, his breath effortless, his entire being expanded beyond the limits of his physical frame. The same hands that once trembled from the stress of responsibility now rested calmly, filled with peace. He realized that in all his years of healing others, he had never touched this level of healing within himself. This was the medicine he had been searching for, not in drugs, not in techniques, not in the external world, but in alignment with consciousness itself. The healer was finally being healed by stillness. The room seemed brighter when he opened his eyes, as if the light itself had changed. Colors appeared sharper, the air felt lighter, and everything seemed connected in an invisible web of harmony. For a few moments, he simply sat there, unable to move, bathing in the afterglow of the experience. He knew something irreversible had shifted within him. His perception of reality would never be the same. He had seen behind the curtain of the physical world and witnessed the truth that existence wasn't confined to matter. It was energy, vibration, awareness. When he tried to describe it later, he realized words were too limited to capture what had happened. It wasn't a mystical event. It was a moment of truth, emerging between the finite and the infinite, between intellect and spirit. He understood now why the constant search for external achievement had left him unfulfilled, because no external success could compare to the richness of inner stillness. He had spent his entire life dissecting the human brain, searching for the origins of consciousness, only to discover that consciousness could not be found in any physical form. It had to be experienced directly, As he sat quietly after the meditation, he didn't feel like the same man. The neurosurgeon who once defined himself by his profession, his skills, and his reputation was dissolving. In his place was someone undefined, free, limitless. For the first time, he didn't feel like he was thinking, he was simply being. The stillness wasn't a void, it was fullness, completeness, a sense of homecoming. Everything he had been searching for in success, knowledge, and validation had been waiting for him in the silence of his own awareness all along. Transformation is never about adding something new, it is about unlearning what no longer serves you. As the neurosurgeon continued his inner journey, he began to realize that most of his life had been a rehearsal of the past. Every emotion, reaction, and decision was a repetition of an old memory disguised as the present moment. The human brain, he knew scientifically, is a prediction machine. It constantly anticipates the future based on what it has already experienced. But what he hadn't realized before was how deeply that mechanism had trapped him in a cycle of repetition. His thoughts were not new, his emotions were not spontaneous, and his behavior was not conscious. He had been living on autopilot, a collection of learned patterns running in the background. Each morning, as he sat to meditate, he began to witness how strong those patterns were. His body resisted stillness, craving the familiar rush of activity. His mind tried to drag him back into the comfort of worry, the safety of structure, and the illusion of control. It wasn't easy to face those reflexes because they weren't just thoughts, they were chemical habits. Each emotion from the past, stress, anger, pressure, had created a neurochemical addiction in his body. He began to see that his body had become more loyal to his past than his mind was to his future. The body wanted to feel the same emotions it had memorized for decades, even if those emotions were painful, because they felt familiar. He started observing his triggers in daily life. A colleague's criticism would activate the old emotion of defensiveness. A delay in the hospital schedule would awaken the same stress response that had fueled his identity as a perfectionist surgeon. Even small inconveniences seemed to pull him back into old emotional grooves. But now, instead of reacting, he practiced awareness. He would pause, take a breath, and feel the emotion rise like a wave. He learned to watch it without becoming it. That simple pause became the space where transformation began. Each time he chose awareness over reaction, he was teaching his body that the past no longer controlled the present. It was during one of those moments of self-observation that he had a striking realization. Every emotion tied to the past had a story attached to it, and he had been telling those stories unconsciously for years. Stories of sacrifice, of stress, of responsibility, of struggle. He realized that his identity was built on those narratives: the overworked doctor, the perfectionist achiever, the man who carried the weight of others' expectations. Those stories had defined his sense of self, and every morning he had unknowingly reaffirmed them by thinking and feeling in the same way. The repetition of those stories had created a personality that wasn't authentically him. It was simply a memory of who he used to be. To unlearn the habit of the past, he began to question those stories. What if he wasn't the product of his memories, but the author of his next chapter? What if identity wasn't fixed, but fluid, constantly reshaped by attention and energy? The more he asked these questions, the more he felt the structure of his old self begin to loosen. He started to experience brief moments of emotional freedom, seconds where he wasn't driven by guilt, fear, or duty. In those fleeting moments, he felt a lightness he hadn't known in years, a sense of possibility not attached to his achievements, but to his state of being. Unlearning became an act of surrender rather than effort. He understood that he couldn't think his way out of his past. He had to feel his way through it. Each meditation became a journey of releasing stored emotions. Sometimes waves of sadness would rise without warning. Other times, he would feel frustration, anger, or grief surface from nowhere. Instead of resisting, he allowed them to pass through him. He realized these emotions weren't signs of regression, they were memories leaving the body. Each release made him lighter, clearer, more aligned with the present moment. Gradually, his environment began to reflect his inner work. Situations that once triggered stress no longer held the same power. Conversations that once drained him now unfolded with ease. He noticed how his perception of time began to change. Days felt longer, yet he was more peaceful. He wasn't racing toward deadlines or running from mistakes. He was inhabiting each moment fully. The past no longer dictated his emotional state because he had stopped feeding it attention. The grip of old identities weakened, and with every layer that dissolved, he uncovered a deeper version of himself, one not shaped by memory or circumstance, but by conscious awareness. He came to understand that the process of unlearning wasn't about forgetting the past, but freeing himself from being defined by it. Every time he chose to observe instead of react, breathe instead of resist, feel instead of suppress, he was training his brain and body to exist in the present. It was a slow rewiring, one that required patience and humility. But beneath the effort was a growing sense of liberation. He was no longer trapped in the feedback loop of old emotions. The neurosurgeon who once defined his life by precision and control was now learning the art of surrender, surrendering not to weakness but to awareness, the kind of awareness that makes room for a new self to emerge. There came a subtle but powerful shift in the neurosurgeon's journey, a turning point where he stopped trying to control his mind and instead began to observe it. Up to this point, he had been working to rewire patterns, break emotional addictions, and create stillness. But now he began to understand something even deeper. The mind can only change when the self-observing it awakens. One morning, as he sat in meditation, he noticed the usual wave of thoughts begin to rise. Memories from yesterday, worries about tomorrow, judgments about himself, even random flashes of conversation. But this time, instead of fighting to silence them, he simply watched them as if they belonged to someone else. A strange calmness filled him. It was as though he was sitting in a theater, watching the movie of his own mind. He could see every thought come and go, yet he no longer felt pulled into the storyline. This experience revealed something profound, the difference between the thinker and the observer. For most of his life, he had lived as the thinker, entangled in the constant mental chatter, believing every thought is truth, reacting to every emotion as if it defined him. But in that moment, he saw clearly that thoughts were just electrical signals passing through his brain, temporary visitors, not the essence of who he was. The true self, the one silently witnessing everything, had been there all along, untouched, pure, eternal. This realization was not intellectual, it was experiential. It felt as though a veil had lifted from his perception, and behind it, a vast awareness was watching the world unfold. The more he practiced this state of observation, the more freedom he began to feel. Each time a stressful thought appeared, instead of identifying with it, he labeled it, "There is stress." When fear rose, he thought, "There is fear." When pride appeared, he noticed, "There is pride." He began to detach from the emotions that had once controlled him. It wasn't denial, it was liberation. By naming emotions as passing states rather than permanent truths, he was separating his consciousness from his conditioning. He no longer said, "I am anxious." He said, "I notice anxiety." That single shift of language changed everything. He began to observe his daily life with the same awareness he brought to his meditations. During conversations, he noticed how the mind wanted to interrupt, prove, or defend itself. When walking through the hospital corridors, he became aware of how his body would unconsciously tense up in response to certain faces or sounds. Even when driving, he observed the mind's habit of drifting into worry or self-analysis. Observation became his new practice, not something to do, but a state to be in. Through it, he learned that awareness is the doorway to transformation. What is observed changes. By shining consciousness on old patterns, he was dissolving them without effort. This shift also revealed another truth. He had been confusing thinking with intelligence. He had assumed that constant mental activity meant awareness, but in reality, it had been noise. The mind's endless commentary had drowned out the quiet voice of intuition. Now, in the space of observation, intuition began to speak clearly. Ideas would come not from analysis, but from silent, soft, yet certain insights that felt deeper than logic. He realized that wisdom isn't something you acquire through study, it's something you uncover through awareness. The observer doesn't think, it knows. As his practice deepened, synchronicities began to appear more often. Patients he hadn't seen in years reached out at the exact time he was thinking of them. Opportunities arose without effort. Conversations unfolded with ease. He noticed that the outer world seemed to rearrange itself according to his inner state. When he stayed grounded in the observer, life flowed smoothly. When he slipped back into the thinker, resistance returned. This connection between inner observation and external harmony became undeniable. It was as though the universe responded not to his words or actions, but to his frequency, the energy of awareness he carried. He also discovered that observing his thoughts with compassion was far more powerful than judging them. Early in the process, he used to get frustrated when old habits reappeared, believing he wasn't progressing fast enough. But now he understood that awareness itself was progress. To notice a pattern is to begin dissolving to it. He started treating each thought like a messenger rather than an enemy. When anger surfaced, he asked, "What are you trying to show me?" When sadness appeared, he whispered inwardly, "I see you." The moment he stopped fighting his mind, the mind softened. Resistance had been keeping his old self alive. Acceptance was setting it free. Each day, as he practiced observing instead of reacting, he began to experience a quiet joy that didn't depend on circumstances. He realized that awareness was its own form of peace. It didn't matter what was happening around him. As long as he stayed rooted in observation, he remained centered. He could walk through chaos and feel calm, speak with difficult people and feel compassion, face uncertainty and feel clarity. Observation had become his power. He wasn't escaping life, he was finally meeting it fully awake. The neurosurgeon who once measured success by precision and performance was now discovering mastery in stillness, the kind that comes from watching the storm without being swept away by it. By the 28th day of his inner journey, the neurosurgeon could sense a subtle but undeniable truth. The person he had been for decades was dissolving. His old identity, the one built on reputation, discipline, and external validation, no longer fit the man he was becoming. It wasn't a decision made overnight, nor was it an act of rebellion. It was a quiet realization that he could no longer pretend to be who he once was. The very structure of his personality, the routines and emotions that had once given him a sense of control, now felt like a cage. He wasn't escaping from his life, he was outgrowing it. Every morning he meditated, every moment he chose awareness over reaction, another layer of the old self began to fall away. He started to notice how deeply his identity had been tied to his profession. For years, being a neurosurgeon wasn't just what he did, it was who he was. The title had become his armor, his mask, his reason for existing. The applause of others had served as proof of his worth. Yet, as he grew more conscious, that external validation began to lose its power. He realized that the identity he had spent his life building was an elaborate construction made of expectations, the expectations of family, society, mentors, and even his younger self, who had once believed that success meant security. The more he examined it, the more he saw that this identity was never truly his. It was a projection of what others wanted him to be. This collapse didn't come with drama or despair, it came with clarity. One morning, as he prepared to head to the hospital, he stood before the mirror again, just as he had weeks before. But this time, he saw through the reflection. The face staring back at him looked familiar but distant, like a photograph of someone he used to know. The white coat that once filled him with pride now felt heavy, symbolic of the burden of an identity that no longer resonated. For the first time, he questioned not the meaning of his work, but the meaning of his existence within it. He had been saving lives while losing connection to his own. Throughout that day, he watched himself move through the hospital corridors with a strange detachment. The sound of footsteps on the polished floor, the hum of machines, the quiet conversations of the staff, everything seemed both real and unreal. He was there physically, but internally he was somewhere else entirely. He could feel the stillness that had grown within him, a silence deeper than thought, a presence untouched by the rush of the external world. That silence began to highlight the contrast between who he was and who he was becoming. He felt an unexplainable peace even amidst the busy environment. It was as if he had stepped outside his own story and was watching it unfold from a higher perspective. That evening, he sat in meditation again, and an image came to him, a snake shedding its skin. He understood it instantly. The skin wasn't bad, it had simply served its purpose. But for the snake to grow, the skin had to fall away. Likewise, his identity had protected him, shaped him, and given him a sense of direction, but now it had become too tight for his expanding awareness. He could feel the friction of transformation, the tension between the old and the new, between the familiar and the unknown. His logical mind wanted to hold on to reason, to analyze, to find comfort in definitions. But the deeper part of him, the observer that had awakened, whispered that freedom only comes when you release who you were to make space for who you truly are. He began to experience moments of emptiness, not as loss, but as openness. There were times when he felt like he was dissolving into the space around him, untethered from labels and roles. That emptiness was not frightening, it was liberating. For the first time in his adult life, he wasn't trying to prove, perform, or perfect. He was simply being. And in that beingness, he found a sense of fulfillment no achievement had ever given him. He realized that identity built on form, on career, possessions, relationships, is fragile because form is temporary. The only identity that endures is the one rooted in consciousness itself. Days later, when he finally sat down to write his resignation letter, his hands didn't tremble. There was no fear, no regret, no second guessing. The words flowed effortlessly, as if written by a deeper intelligence within him. He wasn't quitting his profession out of dissatisfaction. He was releasing an identity that no longer reflected his truth. He wasn't abandoning his purpose, he was rediscovering it. He understood now that healing wasn't limited to the physical body. True healing was remembering who you are beyond the body, beyond the name, beyond the story. As he walked out of the hospital for the last time, he didn't feel the weight of loss. Instead, he felt light, as if decades of conditioning had lifted from his shoulders. The sunset outside painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, and in that moment, he knew that something had ended, but something far greater had begun. The collapse of the old identity wasn't destruction, it was transformation. It was the death of the false self and the birth of awareness. And as he stood there breathing deeply in the evening air, he understood that everything he had sought through achievement was waiting quietly in the freedom of being no one at all. When the neurosurgeon stepped away from the structured world that had once defined him, he expected uncertainty, maybe even fear. But what greeted him instead was stillness, a quiet field of awareness, where the boundaries between the observer and the observed began to blur. For the first time, he wasn't driven by schedules, patience, or expectations. His mornings were now filled with silence, his mind resting in the vastness of the unknown. Each breath felt like a new beginning, as though he was inhaling life for the first time. This was not a man running away from his past. This was a man awakening from it. His old life had been lived through the lens of control and knowledge, but his new life was unfolding through surrender and awareness. He began to realize that consciousness is not a product of the mind. It is the space in which the mind appears. He saw that thoughts were not his enemies, they were simply movements within that vast space of awareness. The more he watched them, the more they lost their power to dictate his emotions. He no longer believed every story his mind told. He no longer sought validation in results or recognition. The neurosurgeon, who once relied on intellect to navigate the world, was now guided by intuition. What he had studied for decades in the human brain, the patterns, the neurons, the pathways, now seemed like only a small reflection of a far greater intelligence pulsing through all things. He noticed how life itself began to reorganize around his new state of being. People who matched his old energy drifted away quietly, and those aligned with his new vibration appeared effortlessly. Opportunities emerged, not through effort, but through alignment. There was no rush, no need to chase. He had become magnetic not because he was trying to attract, but because he was living in coherence. He could feel this energy within his body, a soft hum of vitality that pulsed in his chest, the warmth that flowed up his spine, a peace that radiated from the space between his thoughts. It was as though the universe had finally recognized him, or perhaps he had finally recognized the universe within himself. Each day, he woke up without the old sense of duty. There was no rigid plan, only presence. He spent hours in silence, observing his thoughts, feeling his breath, and listening to the rhythm of life moving through him. What he discovered was astonishing. The same intelligence that had guided his hands in surgery was now guiding his awareness through consciousness. It wasn't that he stopped being a healer. It was that his definition of healing had expanded beyond the physical. He began helping others not by fixing their bodies, but by awakening their minds. People were drawn to him, sensing a calmness they couldn't explain. His presence itself became medicine. Without effort, without intention, his very state of being began to influence the people around him. He no longer sought knowledge from books or mentors. Life itself became his teacher. The wind carried lessons of impermanence. The stillness of water reminded him of reflection, and the warmth of sunlight taught him about unconditional giving. The boundaries between inner and outer reality dissolved. Everything he once categorized as spiritual or scientific merged into one seamless flow of existence. He could finally see that consciousness wasn't something to achieve, it was the essence of who he had always been. The transformation wasn't about becoming someone new, it was about remembering what had always been there beneath the noise of conditioning. He saw clearly that the external world was only a mirror reflecting his internal state. When his mind was calm, life was calm. When he was in gratitude, the world seemed to open its arms. When he stayed connected to the present moment, synchronicities appeared everywhere, the right people, the right words, the right experiences, all unfolding as if choreographed by an unseen intelligence. He realized this was the same energy that had once inspired him to pursue medicine, the desire to understand life, but now, instead of dissecting it, he was living it. One morning, while meditating near a window overlooking the mountains, he felt an overwhelming wave of compassion. It wasn't directed toward anyone or anything specific. It was universal, a love that had no object, only presence. Tears streamed down his face, not from sadness, but from recognition. He understood that this was what he had been seeking all along, the return to wholeness. The love he had been chasing in achievements, in titles, in external validation was already within him. He had simply been too distracted by the noise of the world to feel it. Now, with the mind quiet and the heart open, he could finally sense the pulse of creation flowing through every cell of his being. From that day on, he no longer referred to himself as a neurosurgeon, a teacher, or even a seeker. He saw those as temporary roles necessary, but not ultimate. He was something beyond definition awareness experiencing itself through form. Each day became an unfolding miracle, a chance to embody presence, gratitude, and love in action. The man who once measured success by the number of lives he saved now measured it by the depth of peace he carried within. The one who once believed his purpose was found in doing had discovered that true purpose arises from being. In the stillness of his new consciousness, he understood that the mind serves the soul, not the other way around, and that freedom begins when you remember who you were before the world told you who to be. The story follows a highly successful neurosurgeon who, despite his impressive career and financial success, begins to feel a profound emptiness within. Driven by curiosity and a deep inner restlessness, he embarks on a 30-day journey of self transformation through meditative and mental practices focused on inner awareness and the rewiring of thought patterns. At the beginning of his journey, he struggles to silence his analytical mind, a mind trained to operate through logic, proof, and control. Yet, as he begins to surrender to stillness, he discovers that his thoughts and emotions are not his true identity, but learned patterns keeping him trapped in a predictable reality. Through consistent meditation and inner observation, he experiences moments of deep peace where time and self seem to dissolve. This marks the start of his transformation, from intellect to awareness. Gradually, the neurosurgeon's inner world begins to change. He starts to perceive life as energy and emotion rather than matter and circumstance. Instead of reacting to stress and pressure, he learns to observe them, and in that awareness, they lose their power. As his frequency shifts from fear and control to gratitude and trust, his outer world begins to mirror that change. Opportunities arise, relationships transform, and an unexplainable sense of freedom replaces anxiety. He soon realizes that the identity he had spent his life building, the title, status, and financial success, was not truly his essence, but a mask shaped by expectations. The more he awakens to this truth, the more he feels disconnected from his old self. Standing before a mirror one morning, he no longer recognizes the man staring back. His role as a neurosurgeon, once a source of pride, now feels heavy, a symbol of a life that no longer aligns with his consciousness. As the days unfold, his transformation deepens. The collapse of his old identity is not a loss but a liberation. He understands that he is shedding layers of conditioning the same way a snake sheds its skin, not because the old is wrong, but because growth demands it. This realization leads him to resign from his $500,000 job, not out of rebellion, but from an inner knowing that his purpose has evolved. After leaving his profession, he enters a new state of awareness, a rebirth into consciousness itself. He experiences life not through the intellect, but through presence. Silence becomes his teacher, and intuition his guide. He begins to help others heal, not through surgery, but through energy, presence, and understanding. His state of being becomes magnetic, drawing people and experiences aligned with his elevated frequency. He realizes that consciousness is not a destination, but the essence of who he has always been. The universe, once something he studied externally, is now something he experiences within. Compassion and love flow naturally from him, not as emotions, but as his natural state. He no longer defines himself by titles or achievements. Instead, he lives from awareness, embodying peace, gratitude, and purpose beyond form. In the end, the neurosurgeon's 30-day experiment leads to the greatest discovery of his life, that true healing does not come from fixing the body or controlling the mind, but from awakening to the truth of who we are, pure consciousness. He doesn't quit his job to escape the world, he transcends it. By surrendering the old identity, he allows a new consciousness to be born, one that lives, breathes, and creates from the infinite space of being rather than the limited structure of doing.